Well, thank you all for coming. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Egyptian calendar, and this here is the Egyptian god He, the god of eternity. And just for your information, he's holding the hieroglyph for the year, Renpet, and it sits upon the hieroglyph for 10,000. So he is holding 20,000 years in his hands. So, to start off, what does a cattle herder use to count his cattle?
A calculator.
Yes, that's right. A calculator. Thank you very much, Julian. Well done. So, to bring you all up to date, I believe that, well, I know, the Sahara used to be a grassland. And the rains, the tropical rains from equatorial Egypt were brought north by the glaciers that were receding from the last ice age. And during that time, the rains fell on the Sahara and there was grassland. And the people there domesticated cattle. They were the first to domesticate cattle. And I believe they were the ones who invented the calendar. And just so you all know, everything I say tonight can be done with pebbles. That's all the mathematics that they needed. They did not need writing. So, this here is what I think might have been a calculator. These rocks, there's quite a bit have been found around various sites. They sit flat, and they have these depressions here. And I think the depressions would be perfect to hold your pebbles in. There's different places you could line up the pebbles in the cracks, or those are etched out places where you could group your pebbles and do different calculations. There's also these rings from later times, still pre-dynastic. These are called Clayton rings, and it's like a pot with no top and no bottom. And my idea is it'd be perfect, throw your pebbles in the pot, and when you want to count your pebbles, you just lift the pot away and you have a pile of pebbles that's all grouped together. Title tonight, the Egyptian calendar, a simple timeline, and here's our timeline. This is the date we're going to look at. That's the date that I believe they started counting the days of the calendar, the days and the years. Just a favorite song. Found an old puzzle that someone had quit, tried a few pieces and hoped that they fit, but they're going together so slowly, it may take me forever to know if it's only a puzzle. And the piece of the puzzle that I found, if you watch, I do this at stoplights all the time. Sometimes they blink together. Other times they blink opposite. And any two cycles that run at different pace will cycle together, then they will cycle apart, and then they'll cycle back together again. You can think of two race cars going around a track, one going 100 miles an hour, the other one going 110 miles an hour. Eventually, the slower one will be lapped. And in that case, you can think of sitting on the faster car, watching the slower car in your rear view mirror go away, and then coming back on it. Or you can think of the slower car and watching the car come around and come up behind you. Some other things, two gears going, spinning. So when the teeth line up the same way they started. One of my favorites is, say, October, Friday the 13th. They will come, October the 13th comes on a cycle. Fridays come on a cycle, and so at regular intervals, you'll get October, Friday the 13th. This principle governs eclipses, it governs planetary conjunctions, all kinds of things. I've found a lot of different places where it pops up. So we'll stop the audio track. So tonight's lecture, we're going to break it into three parts. What is known about the 365-day calendar, alignments to other calendars, including the Canopic, Julian, and Alexandrian calendar, which were all used in Egypt, Zoroastrian calendar, and we're going to look at the Mayan calendar too, with a question mark there. And this date is obviously pre-dynastic, so we're going to look at the implications of a pre-dynastic creation of the calendar. So, what do we know about the calendar? Well, today's date, November 19th, 2012, we can compute that it's the 4th day of the 8th month, and nobody would argue with me on that. We know that alignment. The 8th month, the Greeks called it Pharmuthi. I have no idea about pronunciation, but it's the last month of the planting season. And we'll get to the seasons in a little bit, but right here, the number of years counted, that's what I'm getting at, counted from this date right here. And just for fun, if the Egyptians were counting, and they counted the 19th day of the 11th month in the 2012th year, on our calendar, on the Julian calendar, that would be January 16th of 2229 BCE. That's during the reign of Pepe II. So about 200 years prior, the Great Pyramid was built. 200, 300, yeah, about 250 years. We know the calendar counted 365 days every year. They never altered it. And these two guys, they're late period Roman authors, they tell us that every Egyptian pharaoh took an oath never to alter the calendar. Now, the calendar, how it was broken up. There were 3 seasons, Akhet, which is flood season, Perit, planting season, and Shemu, harvest season. Each season was broken up into 4 months, each month having 30 days, and each month also broken into 3 10-day weeks. That makes for 360 days. They also had the Apogemental, which are 5 days outside of the year. They were added on, and we'll get to that later too. Now, the most important day of the year, it's called the opening of the year, Whoop, Renpet. It's the first day of the year. Think of it as New Year's Day. The first day of the first month of whatever year. The next most important date on the calendar is Perit Sopdet, which is the coming forth of Sothis, and observable event. It's generally thought of as the first day that you see the star Sirius after it's been hidden in the sunlight, and you will see it in the morning. Nobody knows exactly how they worked it, whether it was observational or whether it was done by a calculation. I think it was done by a calculation. We'll look at that. Okay, so the Sothic year, the time from seeing that star until you see that star again is about 365 days, plus or minus some. And that plus or minus, a lot of researchers say that it's so small you can neglect it. I think that's a mistake, but when it comes to the calendar, it can be neglected, because if you make it 365 days, we're going to call that the Julian year, which is the average length of on the Julian calendar. When you make it that quarter day, every year, instead of having a leap year, you move the day of the Feast of the Sothic Rise. So think of it as a chess piece sitting on your calendar, and every 4 years, you move that chess piece. Another 4 years, you move the chess piece. And so if you know you've moved it 3 years, or 3 times, you know that 12 years have elapsed. And this movement is the cornerstone of Egyptian chronology. They can't do any chronology without this 4-year movement. And most people assume that it's a 4-year movement. Remember the plus or minus sum? That, if you take it into account, occasionally you don't move it 4 years. You move it on a 3rd year, or you move it on a 5th year. I don't think they ever did that. 10 movements across a 10-day week would be 40 years to move from one week to the next. And this is important. So the Sothic cycle is the time required to move your little chess piece all the way across the calendar and back to the beginning. Now remember, 2 cycles running at different paces will always cycle together. It takes that long for them to cycle together. That's the Sothic cycle. And down here, these are the years when the chess piece would be moved back to the first day of the calendar, New Year's Day. Since we're using the Julian year, it's always July 20th. And this is something that's generally accepted. So we're going to put targets on our timeline. And we're going to shoot for those targets, see what we hit. So, quoting the coffin texts, I am the great Bennu bird, this guy right here, which is in Iunu, what the Greeks called Heliopolis, the city of the sun, the keeper of the inventory of what exists. It means Osiris. What exists means the time cycle and the timeline. And the Egyptians quite often talked about the time cycle and the timeline, and they'd usually talk about them together. Now, in my mind, the time cycle, a cycle goes around, is the calendar. The timeline is the Feast of the Sothic Rise. And the Egyptians looked at it as the slow car. The calendar moved slower than the Feast of the Sothic Rise. And that gets really confusing for a lot of people, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So the first mention of the calendar, of a calendar, is from the Pharaoh Jer. He was first dynasty pharaoh. There's debate about this. The debate is right here. If this is connected, then this hieroglyph would be Ma'at, the feather. If it's not connected, which it has a little point out here, it's Renpet, year. And if it is Renpet, this can be translated as Sothis, opener of the year, which suggests that at this time they were already looking at Sothis and using their little chess piece. What's more, it's before our first target. So if they started at that red target right there, this doesn't fit. Takes us all the way back to this target. Now, the first mention of the 365-day calendar was during the fourth dynasty, the last pharaoh of the fourth dynasty, Shepseskaf. He was a couple pharaohs after Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. And also, right around that red target, during the reign of Zoser, there's a mention of one of the seasons. So we have talk about the calendar, but really the Egyptians didn't talk about the calendar. They cited dates. We have a handful of dates that said, oh, well, the Sothic Rise happened on this date, saying that our little chess piece is sitting on this square of the calendar. But they didn't talk about the mechanics of the calendar in the surviving hieroglyphic record. The first absolutely concrete instances that we have come from Claudius Ptolemy, who around 125 BCE, 125 CE, he published his book, The Almagest, which originally was called Mathematical Syntaxis. But he had a canon in that book that cited, using Egyptian dates, all these things all these astronomical events. And it's actually kind of fun. I sit down with my astronomy software and I open up the canon and it says a lunar eclipse happened on this Egyptian date. So I look at that Egyptian date, and everybody has converted those Egyptian dates into Julian dates or Gregorian dates, but into modern usage dates. And you look at the astronomy software, and there's a lunar eclipse. Or planetary conjunction, there's planetary conjunction. And it's more than 800 years of data. And it's all absolutely concrete. We know that the Egyptian dates in that line up the way they did. But he didn't start his years from my time. He started his years from that. But we hit the first day of, or we hit Wap Renpet, New Year's Day. So we hit a target. Not only that, 3,498 is really close to 3,500, a nice round number. We also have a quote from Censorinus, who tells us that the Feast of the Sothic Rise happened on New Year's Day, or Peret Sopdet happened on Wap Renpet, that our little chess piece was sitting on the first day of the calendar. And he says that that happened July 20th, 139 CE. And if you look, that is 1 year off of mine. And that's okay, because the little chess piece will sit there for 4 years before you move it. He just said that the two were together. He did not say we just moved the chess piece onto that day. And converting it, of course, that is the first day of the first month. And that's how many years would have elapsed. That's 2 Sothic cycles, 1, 2. The next date we have, Theon of Alexandria, who was writing about 400 CE, talked about the era of Menophrys. And when we calculate back when he says the era of Menophrys started, we hit a Sothic date. Again, it's 1 year off of mine. It sits there for 4 years. So I painted those targets. We've got some green targets, and so we're starting to hit some targets here. But they're all not perfect hits. Now, these 3 dates are the cornerstone of Egyptian chronology and the cornerstone of of dating by the calendar. This one misses. This is another cornerstone of Egyptian chronology, and it's a blatant miss. It's July 19th. And we'll talk about the Decree of Canopus later, but something very interesting, 4007 for that date, counting Egyptian years. So we'll get back to that. Moving on, throughout the Middle Ages, people were constantly using Claudius Ptolemy's book. So everybody was familiar with the Egyptian calendar. It was used. And Copernicus, writing De Revolutionibus, used the Egyptian calendar. And he loved it. He loved its regularity. He called it the perfect calendar, which is kind of ironic because the Egyptians wrote of the ugly year or the bad year. They also wrote of the perfect year. The ugly year is the wandering year. That the Egyptian calendar, because it didn't take into account leap years, it did some funny stuff. And they also wrote of the perfect year. They were aware of at least 2 years going on. So, when Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs, people got really confused because the Egyptians were talking about planting in the middle of flood season or harvesting at the beginning of planting season. And winter was summer, summer was winter. They didn't know what was going on until they came across the Decree of Canopus, which started to explain it. It said, all the Egyptian festivals now celebrated in winter shall not be celebrated in some time or other in summer on account of the procession of the rising of the divine Sothis by 1 day in the course of 4 years. That's what happens when the calendar does not take into account leap years. Now, when they said they were planting during flood season, the season was a calendar season. And without leap years, the calendar moved. So they planted when they needed to. but the calendar was named like it was. To the Egyptians, they knew what was going on. Now, the Decree of Canopus is where they really started getting a handle on the Sothic Cycle, where you move the chess piece one day every 4 years. The chess piece being the rising of the divine Sothis. And people like Richard Lepsis were big advocates of the Sothic Cycle, but they didn't know quite how to line it up yet. And along came Edward Meyer, and he lined up the Sothic Cycle, and he boldly claimed that the calendar began on July 19th, 4241 BC. Unfortunately, he used the Decree of Canopus to line it up. July 19th. That was a mistake. Not only that, a guy by the name of George St. Clair claimed July 20th, 4242 BC, which is one of my 4 years that it would have lined up. And he published his work 6 years before Edward Meyer. Edward Meyer, despite having a mistake in his work, gets full credit for lining up the Sothic Cycle and suggesting how it works and how to line it up. Now, granted, Edward Meyer's work is shining, beautiful work. People, hold him up for his chronology, and people make mistakes. George St. Clair, he was a biblical scholar, and people, later researchers, didn't like his other research, his claims. I myself, I'm of the opinion that most people have at least something right. So I always hate it when somebody says, oh, well, that guy's bad research. Well, a lot of his research might have been bad. I haven't delved into it enough. But he got this right. And it's mathematically right. So this system, regardless of who you agree with, everybody jumped on board. Borchardt, Petrie, Breasted, they all jumped on board. And they all loved the Sothic Cycle. Now, Edward Meyer boldly proclaimed the first dynasty started when the calendar started. And psychologically, well, people think, well, calendar, don't you need writing for a calendar? And we know that writing was invented in Egypt right around the first dynasty. Petrie also jumped on board and said, oh, yeah, first dynasty, all the way back here. Whereas Breasted, he said, okay, the calendar started way back here, and we had at least 800 years until the first dynasty. And I think he actually got it right. But around in 1942, Otto Neugebauer publishes his work, and in his work he rightly proclaims, indeed, the only intelligent calendar, the Egyptian calendar, was indeed the only intelligent calendar which ever existed in human history. But he also said, every theory of the origin of the Egyptian calendar which assumes an astronomical foundation is doomed to failure. And a lot of researchers have taken umbrage at that, me included. Where do you get a calendar? Astronomy. Now, the thing that Otto Neugebauer did, he said they didn't know, well, let's put that up there. He said it was created without the knowledge of the Sothic Cycle. In fact, he went further. He said they didn't understand leap years. That's why they didn't work them into their calendar. Because psychologically, don't you want the calendar to stay in the same place? And leap years are what keeps the calendar from moving. But he said they didn't even understand leap years. So they followed something else, and then they fell into this beautiful cycle. They fell into 365, and they used it, and they were very stubborn, and they kept using it. Now, I totally disagree with that. I think that when they created this highly intelligent calendar, they knew exactly what they were doing. And I'll show you why. But in the meantime, if it was created without knowledge of the Sothic cycle and there was something that they were following until it fell into this nice pattern, when did they start it? And with the beauty of the internet, every once in a while I go on the internet and I do a search and I come up with I've got more than a dozen papers that specifically address the start of the Egyptian calendar. And more than half of them will boldly give a date when they started it, or they'll at least give a year when they started it. But the thing is without the Sothic cycle, all these people after Otto Neugebauer started, they followed this, and then they switched to this, and then they discovered 365, and they kept counting, and it fell into this pattern. And my favorite one of those, somebody claimed the Egyptian calendar started January 1st, 3,000 years before the year of our Lord. So it's tied to this future calendar. But this is interesting. Psychologically, he wanted to tie it to our calendar with this nice round number right here, 3,000. So, getting more modern in 2003, Patrick Amara, he published a paper where he's really trying to discount the Sothic cycle, and he states the start of the calendar is lost to time. So, forget the Sothic cycle. But more modern research, Sofiane von Baumard, describes the gliding calendar. And whenever people want to disparage the calendar, they say the vague year. 365, it's close to the real year, but it's vague. I like her description, the gliding calendar. It's also called a wandering calendar, because the calendar moves without leap years. And her description, it's the Sothic cycle. It's the Sothic movement of the calendar. And she also says that, claims there's no precursor lunar calendar. And there's been arguments, some people say that at one time there were 3 calendars in use that the Egyptians were using at certain times. But Antonio Belmonte says there's only one calendar, and they only ever had one calendar. And he claims all festivals and lunar dates were calculated from the calendar, much like we calculate Easter on our calendar. And so they knew all their calculations, and they used all their calculations, but they didn't pass them on to us. But again, he runs along the lines that they didn't know the Sothic cycle when they started the calendar. And granted, for the theories that say they wandered along and fell into the 365-day pattern, if I believe that they didn't have understanding of the Sothic cycle when they started the calendar, his is the best, most reasoned approach. Now, there's all these problems, and Rolf Krauss says, quote, "A way out of this dilemma is the presumption that the 365-day calendar was intentionally planned and inaugurated as a calendar which moved forward through the seasons." They understood it. But again, he's only putting it forth as a possibility. But that possibility suggests the Sothic cycle. So, moving on to alignments to modern calendars, and relatively modern. Now, my first one, I've presented this before. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but I just want to highlight the Egyptians kept current and old chronography, and in Manetho, he cites 3,984 years. Well, if I run that through my system, let's see what happens. Ooh, we get 261 BCE, which is during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, which is when Manetho was alive. So this number right here could be a current count of the years of the calendar. And honestly, for the Egyptians, it would not have been hard. Remember, if you move your little chess piece 100 times, the calendar has elapsed 400 years. So all they would have need to know is how many Sothic cycles and where your little chess piece is. So, I wanted to go back. We hit a target there. Granted, that target is the lifespan of Manetho. It's a big target. Also, I want to point out 3,984 years is very close to 4,000 years. Wasn't there something 4,000 years? So, the Decree of Canopus. Let's look at that. If they enacted the calendar on Peretzoptet of the year 4000, the little chess piece would have moved to the first day of the 10th month. And a little chess piece is July 20th. And it would have been 245 BCE. Well, Ptolemy II died in 246 BCE. In fact, I think he was only about 6 months from his death. There was already a co-regency with Ptolemy III, so possibly Ptolemy III said, well, my father's sick, he's dying. I don't want a new calendar right now. Let's put it off. And he put it off for 7 years. During those 7 years, the chess piece got moved. But the chess piece now sat on the second day of the 10th month. Oops. Well, let's just call the first day of the month the new divine rising of the Sothis. And they created their calendar, and they kind of messed up what I think was the Egyptians' intention. Because 4,000 years would have been the 1,000th movement of Peretzoptet. 1,000 movements. That's like a millennium. In fact, it's 4 millennium of the calendar. So we hit a very tight target right there. Granted, we have the if, but a lot of people say that the Canopic calendar, that's what the Decree of Canopus did. It was creating a new calendar by adding leap years so that the calendar would stop and stay right there. But the Egyptians didn't support it. Well, it's weird because the Decree of Canopus states that it was supported by the temple wardens, the prophets, the higher duals, priests, all who enter the sanctuary of the gods to clothe them, the sacred scribes, knowing things, the divine fathers, and the other priests in their rank assembled from Upper and Lower Egypt on the day of the divine rising, on the rising of the divine Sothis. The Egyptians put this forth to the Greeks. Now, granted, they think that the original decree was written in Greek and then translated back into Egyptian. But the Egyptians let the Greeks mess with their calendar. Unfortunately, I think the Greeks lost their opportunity. And so that makes our target, I think it makes it pretty solid right there. Let's look at the start of the Julian calendar, which is the precursor to the calendar that we use now. And the Julian calendar was enacted January 1st, 45 BCE. And when I run that through my system, that's the last day of the 4th month of the year 4200 counted from this date. 4,200, hey, there's another nice big round number. And also, it's numbers divisible by 4 are years when you move your chess piece. So, let's see. With this, we at least got a rim shot. We didn't hit Peretzoptet. We didn't hit the first day of the year, Waprenpet. But that gives us at least a rim shot. Let's see if we can strengthen that a little bit. Now, started on the 30th day of the 4th month. That's the last day of flood season, Akhet. And remember, it moves. You move your little chess piece. So during that year, you move your chess piece, and that moves January 1st of the next year onto the first day of planting season. I think the implication is when you move that chess piece or you move Peretsobdet, you have planted a new calendar. And this is the calendar that took root. This is the calendar that we kept using until people found the other little flaws. Remember the plus or minus, and they reformed it into the Julian calendar, they reformed it into the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar we use now. I know, I'm biased, but right there, that little target, I'm going to paint it green. It's my talk, I get to paint them green. Let's look at another calendar that was inaugurated in Alexandria. Augustus didn't like the Egyptian calendar moving, and so he, as emperor, he ordered, put a leap year in, start adding an extra day every 4 years. And it was enacted on August 29th of 25 BC, which is the first day of the first month. So we hit that part of the target, and it's 4221. Now, if you think about it, the previous Peretsobdet moved. What result does that have? The new calendar always starts 40 days after Peretsobdet, under my system, with matching movement of Peretsobdet and leap years. So every time you have a leap year, you move Peretsobdet, you have a leap year. You move Peretsobdet, you have a leap year. So I think, let's see, down there, we hit a target again. Okay, now here's an oddball one. Zoroastrian Calendar, thank you. Different tribes in Persia were all using a 365-day calendar, but they didn't line them up properly. And the calendars didn't line up with each other. This tribe used that calendar, that tribe used that calendar, and New Year's Day here was not New Year's Day there. So on this date, the Zoroastrian priests, whoever, reformed their calendar. And whenever I see a date, I run it through my system and I see what happens. Well, it hit the first day of the fourth month. Well, the first day of a month, you have a probability of 1 in 30 hitting it, in just random. So I'm going to paint that one as a rim shot. And I had to include that one because, well, here's another date. And we compute it, we get the first day of the 12th month. Well, another rim shot. And now, I myself, I can picture in Persia some Egyptian or someone affiliated with the Egyptian priesthood is wandering around, and these people are using 365-day calendar, and he tells them, well, let's align it as best we could so we get a first of a month. The Mayan calendar, if you came because in my flyer I said there's alignment between the Egyptian calendar and the Mayan calendar, I don't think so. This one could be pure chance. Not only that, the Mayan calendar did have a 365-day component where they counted 365 days over and over and over, just like the Egyptians did. But that component does not line up with the Mayan date of creation. So if you're a fan of the Mayan calendar, you can lynch me after the lecture. Okay, so let's move on. This brings us back to the first dynasty. And clearly, my date for the creation of the Egyptian calendar was prior to the first dynasty by more than 1,000 years. And a lot of people don't like that. And honestly, as I've been studying this over the years, there have been times when I fall into doubt. I'm like, could it really be 1,000 years before the first dynasty? And, well, with all the targets that I've hit, I say yes. So how did they do it? Well, there's a site in southern Egypt called Nabdiplaya. And Nabdiplaya, let's see, the cattle herders, they were nomadic. They had to move from pasture land to pasture land. And I've been told that raising cattle in the Sahara at this time was kind of like raising cattle in New Mexico or Arizona. They had a tough time of it. There was not that much rain. There was not that much grass. But Nabdiplaya was a depression. And they had seasonal lakes that would fill up, plenty of grass. So numerous tribes, numerous new nomadic tribes would gather together at Nabdiplaya. And when the lakes dried up and the grass dried up or got eaten, the tribes would go out on their nomadic ways, and the next year the lakes would come back, the grass would come back, and the tribes would come back to the site of Nabdiplaya. And while they were there over these thousands of years, they erected standing stones, and these standing stones have many astronomical implications. So we have people who were sighting the stars. Now, let's go back prior to erecting these stones. Why are you interested in astronomy? There's not enough evidence, but I can offer a scenario. Maybe it was this guy over here. Maybe it was this guy over here. I like this guy because he got paid. He got paid for something. And from the size of the cows, he got paid the hind quarter of a nice calf. Nice, that's some pretty young, tender meat there. So, my scenario. Somebody is out watching their cattle, protecting from predators, and every year when he sees a certain star rise right before sunrise, he has to tell people, oh, this pasture land is going to get overused, we have to move the cattle. Something like that happens once every year. Now, cattle herders, they've got large herds of cattle. You have to count your cattle. You know, if you have 100 head of cattle in your herd, or when you're at Nabdiplaya and all the tribes come together and you've got couple thousand head of cattle all grouped together, and you want to segregate your cattle out to go on your way, you count your cattle. And I've been told that one of the major ways, I'm digressing, that they identified their cattle from different tribes was horn manipulation. That as the horns grew, this tribe would bend that horn that way. So every cow that had its horn bent that way, that's my cow, that's from my tribe. Anyway, I digress. This person sitting on the hillside overlooking his cattle sees that star and he starts to wonder, well, how often does that star rise? So he takes a pouch and throws a pebble in when he sees that star. And the next morning, when he sees sunrise, he drops a pebble in his pouch, and he keeps dropping pebbles in his pouch every sunrise until he sees that star again, and he starts a new pouch. What would happen? He'd get a whole bunch of pouches with a whole bunch of different numbers of pebbles, all about 365. But I don't care what you're looking at, arriving at 365 from just counting, you're not going to get it. So, what do? Well, pebbles are malleable, and you can move pebbles from one pouch to another and try and get the same number of pebbles in each pouch. And what happens? You're going to get 365 pebbles in each pouch with a couple left over. And not long down the road, you can figure out that you can put an extra pebble in every fourth pouch. Not only that, if he's looking at the brightest star in the sky, extra pebble every fourth pouch. But what happens if you look at other stars? Say this star right here. I see it during sunrise. Sometimes your extra pebbles go askew. What do you mean askew? Well, sometimes you're going to start to get a pebble that wants to go in the third pouch, and then you get another one which you put in your pebbles once every fourth pouch, and you've still got some extras. And not only that, those extras start building and building. So something's wrong. And you start studying it, and these extra pebbles for different stars can come as early as every 13th year, or they can come as late as 1,000 or more years. Well, let's look at the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, which is the star the Egyptians called Sopdet, which is the rising of Sothis. If it's inside that green circle, which I'm taking a little bit of liberty, it takes 1,000 years before you get an extra pebble that's askew. 1,000 years later, it's going to move. And then you start getting pebbles that are askew about every 700th year. And it'll keep moving as years go by. And guess what? At my start date, let's go back to that one, 1,000 years until you get skew pebbles. By the first dynasty, your skew pebbles start coming more recent, and by the late period, they're coming at a reasonable pace when you're talking about the time scale of Egyptian history. And so, did they know this? Did they realize this? Well, the standing stones, some of them are pointing to Sirius or Sopdet. And one of them dates to around 4,500 BCE. Nabdiplaya was clearly in use, occupied at that time, and it was still occupied by 3,500 BCE. There's another stone alignment to Sirius, the star that we're talking about, Sopdet. They were watching those stars move. Not only that, there's another alignment to a different star that over the course of 600 years, it points to the star 3 different times as that star moved. And why do the stars move? Well, we're not going to worry about that right now. I'll tell you later, but I'll probably forget, so you can ask me. But they're looking at the stars. They're seeing them move. And we do know they move, modern man. Okay, now, stars move. Also, right here, that's about summer solstice. That's the time of the year when the days are long and hot. And winter solstice, that's the time of the year when the nights are long and cold. And the sun moves along the horizon as it rises. Just want to remind you about that. Now, this next thing, I debated putting it in. I put the Mayan calendar in. I might as well put this in. So, I want you to join me out in the desert. Come with me, young initiate. We're going to go to these standing stones at Nabdiplaya out in the desert.
A reworking of this segment will be available on Zao.
Now, an incredible thing about this stone circle, and this is why I decided to include it. The author makes the assertion that the stones in the stone circle most closely match the stars in this year. And I called him, or I emailed him, I asked him, and he described a minimum angle. Let's just leave it at that. And mathematically, a minimum angle is acceptable to come across, come down to a year. I asked him, well, why don't you come, shouldn't it be a range of years? He said, well, this is where I get the minimum angle. This is taking everything into account. This is the year he says that the stones were placed there. What do? I go to my astronomy software and I look at July 20th. My jaw dropped. And if you're familiar with my work at all, well, Mercury, Venus, and Sirius make this kind of triangle here. The reason why my jaw dropped is because on the day I started their calendar, Mercury, Venus, and Sirius make this nice triangle here. And I was speechless. So, but because the calendar circle makes a triangle, makes that pattern, and the start day of the calendar, we see that pattern that I claim, I say it hit a target. Now, that's a very narrow target. Wow. I'm not going to give it a full solid hit. That date, that year, it could be dubious, but let's leave it at that. So let's look at the days closer to the what I claim is the start of the calendar. July 14th, it's a little hard to see. I actually had to change the time because when this lunar eclipse was full, it was so dark you couldn't see it. I would have put the picture up there and you said, lunar eclipse? What lunar eclipse? But on this date of that year, 6 days before I claim they started the calendar, there's a lunar eclipse. Why is that significant? Well, the story of the creation of the calendar is that Nut, the sky goddess, was barren during the days of the year. She could not have more children. But Thoth wanted to create a new calendar, and he needed more gods to do it. And so he challenged Khonsu, the god of the moon, or lunar god, to a game of Senate. And Thoth over here won. Since he won, he was allowed to have 5 days outside of the year. These 5 days are called, the Greeks called the Apogemental Days, the Egyptians called them the birthdays of the gods. And there were 5 gods born on those days. Well, lunar eclipse, win your game of Senate, 5 days to birth 5 gods, which the early Egyptians claimed that the 5 days came before the calendar, and then the start of the calendar. We see a pattern. So I'm going to put a little target there. Also, remember Mercury and Venus on the first day of the calendar? Well, remember that when 2 cycles will move together, Mercury and Venus move together after 40 years on the Egyptian calendar. And after 80 years, they're back again. After 400 years, they have kept coming every 40 years. 40 years, 10-day weeks. That's the time it takes to move your little chess piece 1 week. They structure the weeks this way. This could have been a check to make sure that you're moving your chess piece correctly. And that check is necessary when you are when you don't have writing. A pre-literate society could use this as a check to make sure that they're moving their chess piece at the right pace and don't make any mistakes. And this pattern kept going for 1,000 years. But these patterns, they slowly peter out, and so after 1,000 years, this didn't happen anymore. But 40 years, there's 80 years. And the Egyptians have the story, Horus versus Set. Well, Horus, not Horus the Elder, Horus the Younger, son of Osiris, was conceived and born after Set had killed his uncle, Osiris. They fought for 80 years. And let's see that one up there? Another lunar eclipse. It happens 75 years to the day after the lunar eclipse for the Apogemental Days. And 74 years, it's close to 80 years. And after a time period at the end of Seth and Osiris fighting, Set got the upper hand for a moment and injured Horus's eye. And the Eye of Horus is a representation, it's the hieroglyph for the moon. I'm sorry, when it's drawn as a left eye, it's the hieroglyph for the moon. When it's drawn as the right eye, it's the hieroglyph for the sun. And people have put forth the idea that when the two eyes are drawn together, it's an eclipse. And if the left eye of the moon is injured, then that's an eclipse, would be a good representation of that. But 74 years, the battle lasted 8 years. Horus was able to heal his eye and vanquish Set. But again, we have a pattern. And now this pattern, I haven't seen anybody mention this in the text. Mercury and the Sothic cycle. Well, Mercury's there on the day I say they started their calendar. And if we move to the end of the first Sothic cycle and the beginning of the second Sothic cycle, Mercury's there, real close. And not only that, these patterns continue. So I get to paint that target, and that target, and that target, and that target, and keep going and keep painting targets until Mercury peters out. Now, I know that target way too far, but there's a pattern here. Not only that, after the first Sothic cycle, there's Mercury, there's Venus. Well, hey, let's take a look. So Mercury and Venus, 40 years later, Mercury and Venus, 40 years later, Mercury and Venus, and after 400 years, Mercury and Venus. We have the same recurring pattern. You could identify these patterns with pebbles. Counting your pebbles, and oh, these pebbles make a pattern, and the stars make a pattern. So, before we leave off and sum things up, parts of the puzzle will never be found, and even though pieces are gone, it's a county fair picture. Part of it's there, some of the pieces are still at the fair, and they will be forever. I myself, I see a county fair. That piece of the puzzle is the linchpin. So, in conclusion, it didn't really start out this way, but what I've done, it's called pattern recognition. And mathematics, a branch of mathematics called pattern recognition, it's also called data mining. And when you scan your credit card, it runs through the computer, and the computer runs an algorithm and says, why is this person buying a new car or buying this gold necklace? Or, they're using pattern recognition to try and identify identity theft and credit card fraud. They use pattern recognition in Iraq and Afghanistan to try and identify bombs that are planted, IEDs. They use pattern recognition when they send you emails. And Amazon says, oh, they've bought this, they've bought this, they've bought this. They might be interested in this. So they send you an email to try and get you to bite and buy it. Pattern recognition. These people at Nabdiplaya recognized patterns in the stars. They responded to their recognition of the patterns of the stars by erecting standing stones. They responded by creating a calendar with all these patterns that they recognized. Future generations recognized these patterns and said, hey, at year 4000, we've got this beautiful pattern. Maybe we can use this pattern and hand it on to the Greeks to do something with as a new calendar, as the Canopic decree. This pattern recognition, it keeps going. And I think all the way back here is where the people really started getting a hold of pattern recognition. So, I left all these up here. I'll open up for questions. Thank you. So, any questions? Yes, Robert?
We've been over this a lot of times before.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all the arguments you make for point A can also be made at point B.
Mm-hmm.
And one problem, and there's a problem with point A that's at 4,000 plus BC. That doesn't occur with B. You're talking about cattle herders on the Nabdiplaya. And you're talking about a calendar that has names like inundation, planting, harvest. Those don't go with cattle raisers. Those go with farmers.
Yes.
So this has to be Nile Valley. That suggests B rather than A. It's certainly possible. I will happily agree that it's certainly possible that the guys on the Nabdiplaya understood the 365-day year. The quarrel is with starting your Sothic count that early. I don't think you have to, and I think essentially all the other arguments will work at point B, where you're already into the Nile Valley, as well as at point A. You have one point that was prior to that. In the early the first thing that you have 2 or 3 dates that you were talking about.
Ah.
There was the one with
That one.
the hieroglyph.
That one. Oh, yes, the citation by Jer. Yes.
And that could be a reference to a 365-day calendar, but it isn't necessarily tied to Sothis.
Mm.
So basically, that would be my argument to you is, to sum up, in favor of a somewhat later start.
Okay. And to address that, let's see, we'll start with the last one. The question is, first, we're going to start the reference from Jer that could read Sothis, the opening of the year. Might not be Sothis. It might be Satet, I think. I forget. That's the other argument. Yeah. Well, the hieroglyph for Sothis is a reclining cow. It's not conclusive that that reclining cow is Sothis. And if the hieroglyph above its head is year, then it very well could be Sothis. If it's Ma'at, it probably is not Sothis. Now, choosing a reclining cow to represent Sothis, well, doesn't that mean that the people who were observing Sothis and chose the hieroglyph loved their cattle? So it was at least cattle herders within the Nile Valley or earlier who named Sothis with the reclining cow. Now, also going to point B, which is the start of what I call the second Sothic cycle, you say it could be the start of the first Sothic cycle. And let's see, so what you lose, the patterns that you lose the birthdays of the gods. There is this 40-year cycle, but there's not this 40-year cycle. This 40-year cycle does not have an 80-year eclipse. Let's see, that you keep the era of Menophrase, you keep the era of Nabonassar, but you lose the possibility of the era of Nabonassar starting at a nice round number, the 3,500. The Canopic decree, my interpretation has an if, and you lose that if. I mean, you lose the 4,000 on that. The Julian calendar, you lose the 4,200, but you would keep the moving from planting season, or from flood season to harvest season. And the Alexandrian calendar, you know what? Because the Egyptian calendar counts 1,461 years for the 1,460 years of Julian years. these two would not line up with a movement of the calendar on what I call B. They would line up with a B alternate, one of the other 4 years. So, and the reason why the Egyptian calendar counts 1,461 versus the 1,460 that I said, if you think about the two cars going around the lap, around the track, the faster car has gone one lap further. I'm sorry, the slower car has gone one lap further than the faster car. Because of that, you lose the alignment of the 4 years. That's a minor thing, but that's because you could have a different choice of the 4 years.
Have you tried to run all of your various analyses with the eclipses and so forth at B as well?
Yes, I wrote my own little software package so that I can choose the start date, and I flag it saying, well, this is start date A1, A2, A3, A4, B1, B2, B3, B4. And you don't get the same patterns. You lose a whole lot. So I hope that addresses that. I'm sorry, he was asking if I addressed the patterns starting at B versus the patterns starting at A. And let's see, the first part of your question. Yes, the seasons are named Akhet, Peret, and Shemu, which are flood, planting, and harvest, which are agrarian names. So they're not cattle herding names. But I think that possibly those names might have been attached at B or somewhere near B. And in fact, the first instance of one of those names is right after point B here. And the flood season, well, the lakes would come and flood. So the lakes at Nabdiplaya fit the name of the flood season. That's not totally agrarian, and it's not totally tied to the Nile Valley. The other two names could have been named later. So I hope I addressed that. Yes, Dennis.
Great lecture, thanks. Going back to your calendar with the chess piece representing Sothic rise moving every 4 years.
Yes.
Since the year isn't exactly, as you know, we only have 365 and a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we have to use the Gregorian calendar to kind of account for that. What does that do over time to moving that chess piece every 3 years? Where does that get accounted for?
Okay. Well, the Julian calendar, when it was inaugurated 45 BC, which not 1 AD, not the year of our Lord. That was retro-calculated by somebody around 500 AD by the name of Dionysius Exiguus. So the Julian calendar was started, and it had the one day every 4 year movement. Or not movement, it had the 1 day every 4 year leap year. Since it's not exactly 365 and a quarter, you have a little bit of error. After 1 year, you have a little error. After 2 years, you have double that error. After 3 years, you have triple that error. After 1,000 years, you have 1,000 times that error. And by 15, I should know this date offhand, I think it's 1582. Prior to that, after 1,500 years, that error had amounted to about 10 days. And people started complaining, the Julian calendar is not predicting when we should celebrate Easter properly. So they went to the Pope and they complained, and Pope Gregory came up with, hired people and came up with a system. Copernicus had his own system to fix it. Isaac Newton came up with a system to fix it. I forget the name of the guy who Pope Gregory went with, but he came up with a system to fix it. And the system he chose was to skip leap years once every 100 years, but sometimes not. So yeah, it's a nice long-term system. But when it comes to moving your chess piece, when that little bit adds up to a quarter day, then you want to move your chess piece not after 4 years, after 3 years. And then you keep moving it 4 years until your error adds up to another quarter day, and you move it every 3 years. And that's really an elegant thing about the Egyptian calendar, is by leaving out leap years, you're looking at the error when the error adds up to a quarter day, which comes sooner. When you throw in the leap year, then you run into the problem. You notice your error when it adds up to a full day. And I shouldn't say you notice it, but that's when it becomes noticeable. So it's a matter of resolution. And the Egyptian calendar, by choosing that length, it has a better resolution to identify that error than adding leap years. It took 1,500 years before people cared to correct that error when it came to the Julian calendar. But when it comes to the Egyptian calendar, it would take, I don't know, it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at Sothis, the rising of Sothis, it would take 1,000 years before you notice that error. But if you're looking at other stars, or if you're looking at the sun, it takes 39 years, and then the sun's not doing what it's supposed to according to the calendar. So it narrows down your window to something on the order of a lifespan, versus with the Julian calendar, you're talking about 100 years or more before the error is observable. So I know I'm long-winded. More questions? Anybody? Well, thank you very much for coming.